Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the 2024 Gargi and Vidya Prakash Dutt Memorial Lecture Series, organized by the Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi, with the support of the Gargi and Vidya Prakash Dutt Foundation and in cooperation with ThePrint as a media partner. The Memorial Lecture Series was originally launched by the Institute of Chinese Studies in honor of Professor Vidya Prakash Dutt in 2013. Last year, the ICS took the decision to conduct these lectures in honor of both Professors Gargi and Vidya Prakash Dutt. Professor V.P. Dutt was a pioneer of China studies in India who played a leading role in the establishment of the Department of Chinese and Japanese Studies at the University of Delhi, which is now known as the Department of East Asian Studies. Professor Gargi Dutt, also a doyen of China studies and mentor to many scholars and practitioners, taught at the Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi. 2024, therefore, marks the first edition of the Gargi and Vidya Prakash Dutt Memorial Lecture Series. It is a matter of immense honor, ladies and gentlemen, to introduce our speaker. Professor Barry Norton is an American economist, an expert on the Chinese economy, and the So Kwan Lok Professor at the School of Global Policy and Strategy at the University of California, San Diego. Professor Norton is well known for his balanced approach to analyzing the Chinese economy, where he combines rigorous economic analysis with a nuanced understanding of the political and social contexts of China. In his works on the Chinese economy, Professor Norton covers four major areas: market and transition and system change, industry and technology policy, foreign trade, and political economy. This year's lecture is titled China's Economic Slowdown, Structural, Cyclical, and Systemic. As you are aware, the Chinese economy in the post-COVID era has performed significantly below expectations. This trend is underscored by the waning prospects for meteoric growth and the challenges in devising effective short-term strategies amidst shifting circumstances. The persisting real estate turmoil serves as a poignant illustration of both structural constraints and cyclical fluctuations. Yet, less evident but equally significant is the ongoing politicization of the economy in China, eroding incentives and confidence among businesses and households alike. While a recovery remains within reach, it hinges on substantial policy reforms, a reality that the Chinese government and the policymakers have yet to fully embrace. Today's lecture intends to delve into these complex dynamics and provide a comprehensive analysis of the same. Gracing the lecture as chair, we have Professor Bishwajit Dutta, Distinguished Professor, Council of Social Development, New Delhi, and formerly Professor at the Center for Economic Studies and Planning at the Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. He is also an honorary fellow at the Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi. Professor Dutta has interacted closely with several intergovernmental organizations and has served as a consultant to the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, the UN Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, and the World Health Organization, among many others. I now invite Professor Alka Acharya, Honorary Director, Institute of Chinese Studies, and Chairperson and Professor, Center for East Asian Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, to please speak a few words. I would also request all of you to please keep your phones on silent. Thank you.
Good evening, friends. I do not intend to stand between you and the speaker today, but merely execute a very, very pleasurable task, which is on behalf of the Institute of Chinese Studies and all the honorary fellows and senior academics and practitioners associated with the ICS. On our collective behalf, I would like to express a profound, deep gratitude to the Gargi and Vidya Prakash Dutt Foundation. Most of the people here will acknowledge to a limited or a greater extent their interactions, tutelage with these two notable luminaries in the field of China studies in India. When we started these series, it was only in the name of Professor V.P. Dutt, but pandemic interrupted many an activity. And once we started to resume and got in touch with Miss Anuradha Dutt, she fell in with our plans to recommence these lectures in physical mode with alacrity. It was extremely heartening that she agreed to sponsor this event and, of course, the ones that will follow. And when we asked her whether she had any kind of theme in mind for this year's lecture, she said it's the economy, stupid. So there you are. There was no other alternative, really. I think in these times, you think about China and you think about this enormous question that is looming. And our other valued partners, the ICS-HYI initiative with Harvard Yenching, incidentally, the Gargi and Vidya Prakash Dutt Foundation also sponsors research which enables us to send 2 scholars each year to China and to Harvard to pursue doctoral studies. And that has also contributed in no small measure to establishing the next generation of scholars in this country. And the ICS is very proud to be a part of that initiative. So it was Elizabeth Perry who we met in Hyderabad last year at the All India Conference of China Studies. And she said, why? Barry, of course. And so we started our communication with Professor Norton. And he was quite keen to come. And of course, we organized this visit. And now we are all looking forward to getting enlightened on this most mystifying subject, which is wither the Chinese economy. So once again, with our deep appreciation to the Gargi and Vidya Prakash Dutt Foundation, I welcome you all. Thank you.
Good evening, friends. It's an honor and a pleasure to be chairing this very important lecture. And the first of the series that we just heard, and it's going to go paces. And again, it's an honor to be chairing a special lecture to be delivered by Professor Norton on an issue, I think, on which all of us are very keen to hear what, someone who's been studying the Chinese economy so closely for over decades has to say. Because, for many of us, and most of us who actually follow the English language press, we don't seem to understand what's going on. Yeah, whether the Chinese economy is really downhill, just doesn't have any future. But what Alka said, with the Chinese economy, or there are some sort of green shoots and some light at the end of the tunnel, coming up. Because I think all of us would agree that the Chinese economy is extremely important for the global economy. And as we all know, that the IMF has been telling us that of course, China is a major driver of global growth. And as recently as December, I was actually looking at some of the IMF documents. They said that China still explains about 35% of global growth. That has been the story even earlier, but even after Chinese economy has suffered the shocks, it's as important as that. So, Chinese economy facing uncertainties obviously means a great deal to all of us, the global economy. And at this current juncture, as we all know, that the global economy is not really in the right shape. There have been projections about an impending recession. Somehow the US economy has been, performing better than expectations. So that is keeping the ship sort of floating. But if the Chinese economy really suffers kind of the downturn that has been predicted by many, then the global economy is in for a long period problems. So without any further ado, let me invite Professor Norton to take us through this kind of this uncertainty and what light he has to shed in terms of where we are going where the Chinese economy is headed for, and what he thinks are the prospects, the near-term prospects, and the long-term prospects of the Chinese economy.
I think you stand at the podium here. Thank you. It's an enormous pleasure and honor to be here. I came a long way to be here, and it's been worth it every minute of it. So I very much appreciate the invitation. Look at that title. It's a terrible title, right? China's economic slowdown, structural, cyclical, and systemic. I regret it, and I apologize for it. Let me say it in a more straightforward and simple way. The reason China seems so mysterious right now is that so many different fundamental axes of the economy are changing. Can you hear me in the back? Is that working okay? Okay. If I step back too far from the mic and you can't hear me, please wave and say, hey, I need you to speak up. And because so many different things are changing, it can seem very, very opaque. But I really think that we can boil down the changes to a couple of crucial dimensions. But to do that, let's start with right now. And when we look at right now and the Chinese economy today, what we see from the outside clearly is that the Chinese economy is behaving in a way that's disappointing. Now, we could say in a way, all right, growth last year was 5%. That's not bad. But remember, growth in 2023 is coming on the base of 2022. And in 2022, you literally had people in China who were locked in their apartments by the zero COVID policy, couldn't consume, couldn't work. You had migrant workers who couldn't produce. And so what we're talking about is not that a long-term growth rate of 5% would be bad, but rather the complete absence of a recovery bounce after 2022. That's surprising. It's surprising to a lot of people. And at the same time, from an economist standpoint, we see all these indicators that all point in the same direction. They all point to the idea that macroeconomic policy is set wrong, that aggregate demand is too weak compared to the supply potential of the economy. Now, how do we know that? Well, we know that because young people are unemployed. 20% or more of Chinese young people are unemployed. And remember, this is not a traditional problem of the Chinese economy. As it evolves rapidly, young people with skills typically have been absorbed quickly into the economy. Household sentiment is very negative, and I'll show you a picture of this in a second, but it's something that you definitely feel when you go to China. You talk to people, their view of the immediate economic future is surprisingly negative, and this is reflected in an almost zero growth rate of private investment. Prices are falling. Not very much, but China's in a mild deflation, and that's very surprising because the Chinese currency has depreciated substantially over the last 2 years. So normally we think currency depreciation, inflationary pressures, but China has mild deflation. And of course, the stock market is doing terrible. So all these indicators say, hey, there's something wrong with the way economic policy in China is being managed today. And so, in part because of this, there's an enormous change in perception taking place. And part of my argument today is going to be this change in perception. Of course, parts of it are completely overstated, but this change of perception is reasonable. That there are fundamental changes in the way the Chinese economy operates that means this is not the old China anymore. We're not in the old miracle growth China that was capable of generating 10% per year economic growth numbers. Now, of course, on one level, that's true for simple structural reasons. That's the structural word there. But it's also true for economic policy reasons, and it's also true for economic system reasons. So with all these changes going on, we should expect to see that the Chinese economy performs dramatically different, not just in speed of growth, but in other characteristics. Now, here's a couple of headlines pulled from the American press. Who killed the Chinese economy? Well, obviously, nobody killed the Chinese economy, right? It's still alive. But you can see how dramatic this change in external perceptions of China has been, to the extent that in Washington, D.C., the atmosphere actually gets a little crazy sometimes. You have people saying, oh, China has peaked, it's not going to be a global power, et cetera, et cetera. Those views are overstated and wrong. But they also illuminate some truths. In the first place, they give form to the shock that many people see on, just looking at the outcomes of China's economic performance. And I want to stress three things here that we have gotten used to seeing about China that are now in doubt. Of course, the first is the most obvious, just really dramatic economic growth. From 78 to 2010, China's economy grew at 10% per year. That is the fastest, longest any economy in the history of the world has ever grown. So, of course, that has all kinds of implications for how Chinese people view their world, view their government, view their position in the world. But it's also over, right? The conditions that must come together for this kind of miraculous growth include a demographic dividend, massive migration from rural to urban, massive structural change, massive technological borrowing. All these things have to all come together. They did come together, but now they don't. This is over. But there's another aspect here that's even perhaps, in some ways, perhaps more important, because everybody knows that China's miracle growth had to end. We predicted it. It happened. It's not a surprise to anybody. But there's another way in which we'd become accustomed to thinking about China, right? Which was that China had a pragmatic, responsive economic policy that prioritized economic growth and development. So, boy, China, the Chinese Communist Party could be difficult to deal with in all kinds of different dimensions. But when you looked at the economy, when push came to shove, they generally did the right thing, right? A problem would come up, maybe there'd be a delay in dealing with it, but especially during the 1990s and the early 2000s, there might be a delay in dealing with it, but eventually, boom, they'd take care of it. And we saw, especially in the global financial crisis, that Chinese policymakers were extremely proactive, right? The shock waves of the global financial crisis rippled out from New York and threatened to sink the whole world in a new Great Depression. But one of the things that stopped that was the extremely proactive actions by Chinese policymakers to jack up investment, to put people to work, to replace external demand with domestic demand in a way that was extremely positive for the global economy. And at the same time, central policymakers were behaving in that kind of pragmatic and proactive way, but also economic decision-making was dramatically decentralized, right? So even if people in Beijing got it wrong, people in Shanghai, people in Shenzhen, people in Guangdong often got it right and tried new experiments and new approaches. So that's the China we're accustomed to, right? And also a China that was making the essential investments, making the investments in infrastructure, sure, everybody knows about that, but also making the investments in human capital, both domestically through the education system, and even more important, internationally, sending students abroad, facilitating families sending students abroad. So, of course, as somebody in an American university, I don't I can testify to personal experience how much our universities have been transformed by smart Chinese students and, of course, smart Indian students who come and are many of the very best students. And then most of them go back home and contribute that knowledge, that science, that technology. So that's the China that we're used to. And some parts of it are still there, but many parts are now gone. It's not the old China anymore. And it's not just somebody from America saying that. Here's a reading of Chinese domestic consumer confidence. This is an index, above 100 represents positive expectations about the future. Below 100, basically the perception that the future is going to be worse than today. Chinese National Bureau of Statistics has produced this index since 1990. Nobody ever paid the slightest bit of attention to it because expectations were always highly positive, right? Once the reform process really got underway in the 1990s, Chinese households knew correctly that the future was going to be better, and their expectations were high, and they knew that jobs were easy to define. And then you get this drop in April 2022. Anybody tell me what triggers that drop? Anybody know? It's the Shanghai lockdown, right? The zero COVID lockdown in Shanghai, where millions of people are caught in their apartments. They can see that it's a irrational economic policy, and their expectations of the future drop dramatically. And then the incredible thing is they stay down through today. You can see them sort of ticking up a little bit. There's a peak there in February, March 2023. That's after the collapse of the zero COVID policy in November 2022. People think, okay, we're coming out of this. It's going to get better. And then, no, boom, it doesn't happen. So this belief that things are different now, it's not just outsiders. Chinese households think that too. And I must say, I spent a couple months in China last fall. I heard all the time people saying things like, yeah, we're not going to take a vacation this year or this Chinese New Year because of the economy. But without explanation, right? Nobody would say, that this was a specific thing. And of course, at the heart of a lot of it is this housing downturn. And look at this graph. All these lines back to the beginning of 2022 are below zero. So the housing sector has been continuously weakening now for more than 2 years. It may hit bottom pretty soon, but this is certainly a factor that has a big impact on people's expectations, has a big impact on their wealth, and it's something that is related to the end of the miracle growth period, right? Because for a long time, when growth is high, people are looking for places to invest, looking for places to store their money. Due to the flaws in China's financial system, there aren't that many alternatives. And so people in China have grown accustomed to storing their wealth in the housing sector. It's crucial for many, many middle-class urban families. But then you get to a point where the ultimate demand for housing flattens out because migration to cities is winding down. People don't need new apartments. Of course, people will always upgrade, but the upgrade demand for housing is always going to be less than the need to house people for the first time from substandard to adequate housing. IMF estimates that the long-term demand for new housing in China is going to be about 50%, 45% less, they say, than the new housing that was produced as late as 2 years ago. So there's this long-term structural adjustment that has to take place. Now, so what was, and there, right, at the bottom here, I raise a question, right? And the question is, the National People's Congress that just met, right, not even a month ago, about a month ago, everybody was waiting to see how the National People's Congress would frame an economic response to all these challenges that I just mentioned. And the answer puzzled everybody, because the answer was, they basically said, we're not going to do anything. Now, why do I say that? Of course, they did say that they want to expand domestic demand. But take a look at this table. One of the traditions of the Chinese National People's Congress is that the premier gives a report on the work of government. And in this report, there's always a list of priorities for economic work for the coming year. And what you can see from this particular table, I hope, and I guess it looks probably a little fuzzy from the back, but what you can see is that for last year, for 2023, the top priority was expanding domestic demand, which is what economists would counsel. That's a good orientation. You could argue they didn't follow through on it, but still, at least they were stating the right objective. But this year, that objective still exists, but it's been demoted to number 3. And it's qualified, right? Expanding domestic demand and promoting sound economic flows, integrating markets. And 2 other things, in particular, one, modernizing the industrial system, or actually accelerating the construction of a modernized industrial system, whatever that means, is the top priority. Now, we'll come back later in this talk and talk about exactly what that means. But the key point is, according to the official proclamations of the Chinese government, expanding aggregate demand is not the top target, but this other goal, this vague sounding, almost meaningless in English, accelerating a modern industrial system, that's the top goal. And part of my argument today is we should take that seriously. That's what they're doing. That's what they mean. Okay? So when we look at these changes, the most common way to talk about it, to think about it, is some people are saying, look, the most important changes are structural, meaning the things I was talking about at the beginning. As we get to the end of this very rapid miracle growth period, there are a whole series of new economic challenges that need to be faced. But it's also cyclical in the sense that I've just been talking about. The macroeconomic policy should be more stimulative, either through more credit, faster growth of the money supply, or through a more expansionary fiscal policy, having deficit spending in order to pump up the economy. So let's talk for a few minutes about the structural challenges, because those are very, very significant. You can see that GDP growth, just by trend, of course, it's a slightly false trend because COVID is weighing on one end of it, right? And COVID is now gone. It doesn't, so it's not that growth is going to decline to 0. But clearly, there's this long-term movement away from the 10% growth and towards something that we might think of as being more like 4 to 5% long-term. And as this is occurring, look at what's happening short-term to China's inexorable rise, right? From the late 90s until 2021, China's share of world nominal GDP increased dramatically, right? It's that the increase of that blue line is sort of what's happening in our world today, right? This is the rise of China. But look at the last 2 years. China's share of global GDP in nominal terms has dropped almost 4 percentage points, 3 percentage points. Now, granted, that's largely a reflection of exchange rate changes. China's real economy is still growing. It's growing faster in real terms than the world economy is growing. But because the Chinese currency, the renminbi, is depreciated significantly, its share of nominal global GDP has actually dropped. So it's a complex phenomenon. It doesn't mean that China is losing losing its growth potential, but it does mean that its sort of immediate emergence onto the world stage has been pushed back a little bit, has been slowed a little bit. The headline says India's population, because I prepared this slide for a China audience, and I was making a comparison. I think you all know far more about India's population than I do, but look at we're a little off out of sync here, but this dark blue line is the median age of the Chinese population. We're here. And so we're right at this point where China's population is aging, not just more rapidly than other populations, but more rapidly and in a more extreme way. So that China very quickly is going to be older than the typical developed country. And here's a population pyramid. You know, if you're not familiar with this, probably just tune out. But just to remind you, a population pyramid starts with people of young children down here and just shows the size of each age cohort up to, 80. This is the 2020 census at China. So if we add 4 years to everybody, we can see there's this shelf here, which is the crisis of the Great Leap Forward, when basically no babies were born and mortality. And then this population bulge is retiring. These people are leaving the labor force permanently. And the young generations coming up, the 1-year-old generation here at the bottom is the first of 5 successive super small birth cohorts. So China's going through this rapid demographic transformation. True, other countries are going through the same demographic transformation. The world is getting old. That's happening, but it's happening faster in China, especially for a country at a relatively low, lower middle income level of household consumption. And what we know is this transition is hard to manage, right? Think about Japan. Japan, like China, grew at 10% per year. China did it for almost 40 years, for a little more than 30 years. Japan, 25 years. But what happened in Japan when it reached the end of those miracle growth conditions? The growth rate dropped discontinuously from 10.5% to 5%. Then it went another 15, 20 years, and the growth rate dropped from 5% to 0. And Japan underwent 2 decades of stagnation. Does that mean that China is destined to follow the Japanese path? No. But what it does mean is that the adaptation of development strategy, the adaptation of financial policy, the adaptation of macroeconomic policy to the sudden end of a very, very rapid growth period is something extremely difficult and extremely challenging. This means that it's a tough technical challenge for Chinese policymakers, and it also helps to explain some of the things that China is doing. Because China is taking steps that it thinks will help it avoid a Japan-like outcome. I think they're wrong, but that's part of what motivates them to act in the way they're acting. They're gambling, in essence, that rather than letting the economy slow down in a Japan-style stagnation, that they're going to use government intervention to push a continued transformation of the economy and keep growth rates high. By high, I mean 5 to 6%. We'll see if they can do it or not. Now that leads us to the third part of this talk. And here I think is where most of the novelty of this talk lies. You can see discussions of these structural changes and cyclical changes in other works on the Chinese economy, but you rarely see a full accounting for the transformative vision that Xi Jinping is imposing on the Chinese economy for better and for worse. Xi Jinping's objective is not economic growth per se. Xi Jinping's objective is the creation of a high technology manufacturing power that is independent of the global economic system dominated by the United States. And so he is engaged in transforming the institutions of that economy so that they can be more effectively steered by the government. And when Xi Jinping talks about reform, that's actually what he means, is more effective steerage, more efficient steerage. Now, what does this mean in particular? I think the easiest way to understand it is by looking at China's industrial policy, or as we like to call it, techno-industrial policy, because so much of it is focused on high technology sectors. And the short story is this industrial policy really got underway in 2006. And it started quite modestly. But since 2006 to the present, it has steadily ramped up in intensity. By intensity, I mean mobilization of resources, scope, the objectives, and instruments, the intrusiveness of the instruments used to steer the economy. Here's one example of an instrument. Dates back to 2014, 2015. It's something called a government guidance fund. There's two things about government guidance funds that I find fascinating. First is they're designed to be market conforming. That is to say, they're like venture capital funds. They're government-sponsored and government-organized venture capital funds with managing partners who are responsible for the investment and limited partners, often state enterprises, who provide the funding. So there's an intention to do government-directed investment, but do it with accountability and with attention to rates of return. That's pretty interesting. The other thing is, take a look at the scale of what we're talking about here. Between 2014, when they were basically zero, and 2020, when growth leveled off due to COVID, the scope of these funds, which means their permission allocated to raise money, reached $1.5 trillion US dollars. This is just one instrument of Chinese industrial policy. So you can see that this is a very large commitment that the Chinese government is willing to make. And maybe even more crucially in some senses, what China means by industrial policy has gradually incorporated three different classes of objectives, three different types of policy. It starts out with something we might think of as traditional industrial policy, something a lot like what Japan and Korea did in the 70s and 80s. That is, opportunistically looking around and saying, well, where are the sectors where we can have a new growth pole, a new growth dynamic? And for China, this gradually became strategic emerging industries, formalized into a document in 2010. And one of the strategic emerging industries that China has consistently promoted is electric vehicles. And as I'm sure you know, China's electric vehicle sector today is very strong and is coming on strong into global markets, creating a very successful outcome, but also one that's quite destabilizing. So that was something relatively familiar. But then from about 2014, something else got layered into this, a new type of industrial policy, the innovation-driven development strategy. And when you look at some of the documents on this, it's really quite remarkable. It says, in so many words, a new technological revolution is sweeping the world. Those that master this revolution will become the dominant powers of the next few decades. This technological revolution is based on green, ubiquitous, interconnected technologies, and the key is to invest in artificial intelligence. All of these things are relative commonplaces today, since large language models changed everything, in the last year or two. But these were incorporated into Chinese policy beginning in 2014. And then a third wave is economic and technological self-reliance. And of course, if you want, you can blame the United States for this. There's no question that the self-reliance theme is a response to the sanctions first initiated by the Trump administration and then maintained and to a certain extent focused on technology under the Biden administration. But the Chinese response to this has been also quite extreme, because the Chinese response has been to, on both a technological and an industrial level, to really emphasize the need and importance of self-reliance. And so that's a big deal. Now, any one of these would be an important feature of Chinese economic policy. But when a new one comes along, the old one doesn't go away. Strategic emerging industries are still with us, right? And so Chinese industrial policy today focuses on fostering all of these objectives, even when, to a certain extent, they're contradictory, or maybe not contradictory, but competing for resources and competing for policy instruments. I'm going to skip this because I know we're taking a lot of time, but I do want to show this screen because this is about a closer reading, a deeper dive into that slogan, which is the top objective for this year in the government work report. A modernized industrial system could hardly be more bland in English, right? The Chinese is a little bit more clear, but not much. But the key point of this slogan is to acknowledge that the global economy today is not one that can easily be classified and broken down into individual industrial sectors. Instead, it's a really complex, interconnected web that includes specialized suppliers of things like sensors or, ball bearings and specialized services, inputs into management consulting and engineering firms, and that the global economy, especially the high-tech global economy, is this extraordinarily complex web made up of different kinds of organizations that have very, very different needs and very different characters and very different scales. But guess what? The point is, China needs to replicate all of this kind of production web inside China. It doesn't mean isolation of China from the rest of the world, but it means that China has to have at least one supplier of every one of these components into a modern industrial system. I'm going to skip this one too. But so you can see now that's the objective that got promoted from number 2 to number 1. So Chinese policymakers are telling us very clearly, we're not inflating aggregate demand because we think it's more important to create this comprehensive high-tech industrial system. And as they do that, remember I showed you an instrument before, the government guidance funds that I said were market conforming, but now notice the government's becoming more activist. It's now starting to create innovation consortia where, I'll show you a little picture, I don't know if it's going to help or not, where scientific resources, engineering resources, and major firms are organized together by the government and given a specific engineering target. And there are hundreds of these innovation consortia in China today, many just being set up by local governments, some in place for a while. And if you read about the achievements of the Huawei company, which are considerable because it's a very impressive company with extraordinary morale and extraordinary engineering skills. But if you read about some of their achievements, these achievements come from innovation consortia that are managed by Huawei, but where the government says to other companies and to other research facilities, you are expected to participate in this. We're going to tell you what the goal is, and you sign contracts to make sure that you meet these goals. So again, this is a new level. So what does this mean? Let's just take stock for a second. There's one more point that I want to make before I start to get to the conclusion. But before we get to that, next to the last point, let me just point out that industrial policy has evolved past something that means selecting particular sectors and has de facto become a program for government management of the entire manufacturing economy, right? China has decided that that's the way to protect China in coming conflicts with whoever, but in particular with the United States. To do this is very expensive, right? Think how expensive this must be, because you're essentially saying, we're going to, all the areas where China grew rapidly because we could tap the world's best technology for key high-quality inputs and then focus on assembly and manufacturing, which is exactly the pattern of Chinese growth over the first 20 years of the 21st century. We're going to change that by investing to have the capability to replace those high-quality inputs. We're going to invest in all of the things that weren't developing competitive advantage under market conditions heretofore. So it's got to be very expensive. And there's something on the agenda right now, and that is the risk of a new trade war. And right now, I think this week, maybe next week, U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen is going to China, going to Beijing. The idea is she's considered to be the most pro-Beijing among Biden's top advisors, and her message to China is, do not dump heavily subsidized output from subsidized manufacturing sectors onto the U.S. market. It's a warning, and it's something that is very much, as we look ahead, this is something to keep an eye on. This is something that's going to roil global markets, and here's why. This looks simple. It's actually somewhat contested because Chinese data on exports, commodity exports and imports, are going through some kind of change so that balance of payments exports and customs exports are diverging. Well, we don't know why that's true, but this is customs exports. This is what's happening to China's manufacturing goods surplus, export surplus, as a percentage of global GDP. It's gone from, this surge here was the so-called China shock in the United States, where China, after joining WTO, dramatically expanded its exports to the United States with strong negative economic consequences to the U.S. But look, there's another surge underway and potentially further in the future. Final dimension, systemic. I've talked too long. We don't really have time to go in this. Let me just make one very simple point. And that is Xi Jinping has been consciously altering the incentive system in China at every level. And that means that economic decision makers in China face a new set of incentives. It used to be everybody was aligned on economic growth. Decision making was decentralized, but everybody, in some sense, had almost the same goal. Now it's different. Xi Jinping has explicitly said, I want you to pay attention to the complex and multidimensional objectives that I set, which include, for instance, things like increasing the birth rate, common prosperity, and of course, building China into a technology superpower. So people's incentives are changing, and theory tells us that these changes in incentives should make the economy economically less efficient and less stable, in the sense that people are more attuned to adjusting and responding quickly to the leader's commands. So, what do we learn? Last couple slides. First, there really has been a fundamental change in the nature of Chinese economic policy. And so we know there's this fundamental change in the structure of the Chinese economy as miracle growth ends. But we can also see, both from the macroeconomic policy outcomes and from the changes in the incentives that are built into the system, that there's also been a fundamental change in the way the policymaking system works, the way the incentives work. So structure and system are both changing right now. This largely explains the recent underperformance of the Chinese economy. Because what's happening? The aggregate economy needs more stimulus, but the government's already pouring resources into high-tech manufacturing. They can't really pour more into other kinds of fiscal deficit, but manufacturing investment, especially high-tech manufacturing investment, not really a very effective form of stimulus because it doesn't have any second-round effects. It doesn't have any short-term payoffs, but it still strains the budget of local governments. The city of Shanghai, for instance, has 52 specialized high-tech industrial parks. No, 52. That costs a lot of money. These are not the old-style special economic zones of China. These are government-sponsored coordination points where firms are clustered together to create those kind of innovation consortia that I talked about earlier. And so the Chinese economy does face real challenges, managing the end of miracle growth, figuring out how to serve the aging population, trying to understand what kind of institutions need to be developed, because the fiscal institutions are creaking. They're not really working. They're paying enormous costs, and there's a potential backlash to all of this building, especially through the developed world, not so much through the emerging and developing countries. So it's really, in that sense, the challenges are just as serious as people are portraying them. But on the other hand, the naysayers underestimate, to quote George W. Bush, the capabilities and potential of the Chinese economy. First of all, even though I'm quite critical of these industrial policies, we have to acknowledge that China isn't just relying on these government intervention industrial policies. They're also investing in people, investing in science, investing in infrastructure, investing in resources. So they're building a lot of the base level capabilities. And that means some of the things that China is working on are going to work. They've already got more competitive electric vehicles. Yeah, subsidies are a big part of it, but they're not the whole story, right? So some of these are going to work. And who knows, there is a technological revolution going on, and China's going to reap some of the benefits from that. Finally, and this is the last point, the wounds, the problems that China faces, these are mainly self-inflicted wounds. They can stop doing it, and their economy will perform better and grow more rapidly, and the Chinese people will be happier. Unfortunately, Xi Jinping isn't quite ready to make that course correction. And I suppose if I were him, I might start to think about making a course correction, but I might also think, well, let's wait and see what happens in the United States in November. Maybe we'll have to deal with a different administration that will create a whole set of new challenges. Let's retain our maximum ability to respond flexibly. So, a lot going on in the Chinese economy, and I look forward to discussion with you about some of the points of this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Norton, and this is absolutely fascinating to this journey that you took us through as to what is happening in China. Obviously, and let's see very strong trend of Xi Jinping, and when it the Made in China policy in 2015, and his ambition was to make China manufacturing superpower by 2049. Now the question is that, are these the building blocks towards this ambition of his taking China, an industrial superpower? The second interesting thing is that Xi Jinping is here to stay now. So unlike what happened in the past, there's high growth phase that you talked about, where you had the different leaders coming and sort of changing their priorities, looking at the reality, the global reality, and the Chinese reality, and making course correction that you were talking about. You can't expect that now in China, unless, of course, Xi Jinping itself, does a U-turn and starts thinking differently. So even in terms of the leadership and the kind of, the policies that are coming from the leader and the way it is dealing the economy and the polity, we have a very different system from what we had over the past, since 1978. So I think there's lots that we would see happening in the next months and years. And of course, what I find again very fascinating is that when US is talking about friendshoring and reworking global value chains, getting the strategic partners around, China is moving more inwards, and it's actually talking about a classical kind of sort of import substitution policies. And when you look at another facet of this, what you can see is that over the past couple of years, foreign direct investment into China has actually fallen quite rapidly. Now, is it in response to what is going on in terms of the policy shift that we're talking about? Is it that for multinationals are getting less interested in China now? And we need to see how this dimension also pans out. So there is another story to be told as to how Chinese integration, continued integration in the global economy, will sort of change character, if you like. So there are a lot of things there. These are some of the issues that really fascinated me, and thank you very much for enlightening us with all the facts and figures and your perspective as to where China is going. The foundation, the Gargi and Vidya Foundation, for taking time out from a very busy schedule, and he was just sharing with me before we started speaking that he just squeezed in this travel to India in between his teachings. And so really grateful to you for having found time and spend this evening with us, and look forward to more interactions with you in future, in person or online, and possibly both. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Elizabeth.
On behalf of the Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi, I would like to extend our gratitude to Professor Barry Norton and Professor Bishwajit Dutta for their insights and for gracing today's lecture with their presence. The ICS conducts regular seminars and conferences throughout the year, and we would like to invite all of you to the second All India Conference of East Asian Studies, which will be held online from 5th to 6th April 2024. Thank you for joining us this evening, ladies and gentlemen.